Now, ahead of our first panel, starting in just a few minutes, which is Decoding Climate Risk, Data, Law and the Path to Resilience, we have a short message from Ian McDougall, President of the LexisNexis Rule of Law Foundation.
Hello. It's a privilege to join such a distinguished group of speakers, including Ban Ki-moon and Erica Gerritsen, to name just two, to discuss one of the defining challenges of our age, how we accelerate progress towards the sustainable development goals, including dealing with climate change. The SDGs remind us that climate action cannot logically be separated from the other global priorities. Climate, health, the rule of law are interconnected. Progress in one area often depends upon or can affect progress in the others. My own work has focused extensively on the rule of law. Citizens need confidence that environmental standards will be applied fairly and consistently. Businesses need predictable frameworks that enable innovation while maintaining public trust. And governments need institutions capable of delivering long-term policy objectives that extend beyond electoral cycles. The rule of law provides that foundation. So too does access to reliable information. In a world increasingly shaped by technology and artificial intelligence, trusted information is the lifeblood of sound decision-making. The world is flooded with unreliable information. Those with a commitment to high-quality information will become increasingly important as the climate change debate, as well as the rule of law, becomes important. Without it, nobody can make informed choices about climate risks and opportunities. Sadly, we're going through a period where scientific information, indeed the idea of facts, needs to re-establish trust in the population. If we can promote trusted information, it'll help uphold the rule of law, support climate action, and strengthen support for all of the Sustainable Development Goals. My hope for the coming year is that we can step up to this challenge, support quality information and education so that people can make the right decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ian. And now, without further ado, it is time for our first panel, Decoding Climate Risk, Data, Law, and the Path to Resilience. Justin Worland, our panel host, is Times Senior Correspondent covering energy and climate, and the founder of Futureproof, which is Times' platform for navigating the new energy and climate economy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on decoding climate risk, data, law, and the path to resilience. For a long time, climate has been discussed as a sustainability issue around emissions, pledges, reputational issues, and increasingly, though, businesses are waking up to the risk as a business risk, seeing it as a legal risk, an insurance issue, seeing the real risks of physical risk in their supply chains and their operations. Even as that's the case, some businesses are still struggling with what to do next. Policy is uncertain, data gaps remain. So we're going to dig into all of those things in this session, and we've got three great panelists to do that. We have Laura Clarke, who is the CEO of ClientEarth. We have Simone Davidson from LexisNexis Legal and Professional, and Caroline Elliot-Grey from LexisNexis Risk Solutions. So I want to start maybe with a broad question on the premise I laid out to sort of start this panel. Do you see businesses still treating climate risk as a sustainability issue rather than a core business issue? And to the extent that that's true, what needs to change? I'd love to hear from each of you, maybe starting with Laura, and then Simone, and then Caroline.
Thank you so much, and it's lovely to be here. Of course, I mean, in its true sense of the word, sustainability should all be about core business strategy and risk, right? Because it's about the long-term commercial viability of a business and the impact on the planet. But I think perhaps the problem is that in recent years, sometimes ESG has been put into the PR departments, or it's been made into a kind of tick box compliance issue. But actually, whether or not ESG goes out of fashion politically, the very real climate risks and biodiversity risks remain, and in fact they increase, and we are seeing increasing acknowledgement of that. For example, JP Morgan produced a report on tipping points recently and the importance of pricing them in. So I think my point is we have to accelerate efforts for boards and leadership of companies to really put climate and nature risk right at the heart of business strategy, really start pricing physical transition and liability risks properly. And to really protect themselves, they need to actually walk the talk and do all that they need to do in terms of transition plans, supply chain exposure disclosures, and so on. And really, and the final thing I'd say, and then I'll stop, is to do all of that, they also need the support of high standards and the right regulatory framework. And that's also an important part of the picture.
Thank you. That's
Simone?
similar. Yeah, similar thoughts from me. I guess my take on it is that we're seeing
You're
quite
muted.
an uneven.
Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, Caroline, do you want to maybe go and...
Yeah, sure. So I guess looking at it from a slightly different lens, and it's looking at it from that insurance lens, that it is similar to what Laura was saying. I think insurers are on this journey, and they're trying to understand what it means for them and how they use the data within insurance. I think the view is very much an insurance policy is, it's for 12 months. So they're looking at the risk for today, but actually it's bigger than that. And it's that broader picture of what it means longer term, not just for somebody taking out insurance policies, but also what it means for the company and how they make that, like say, more than just about sustainability, but really embedding that in the decisions that they're making day to day.
So my take on this is kind of similar to both of what Laura and Caroline were saying, is that I see it more on a scale. So there are those businesses that are kind of not really engaging with climate risk very well. They've kind of got their heads in the sand, or they think there's no material risk at all. Climate risk doesn't really feature for them as a disclosure item. And then as I move up the scale a little bit more, I see those businesses that are treating sustainability and climate risk as a sort of narrative storytelling piece. They're likely to have sustainability teams, but they're probably not working with the rest of the business, and they probably don't have much buy-in from the SLT and senior leadership teams. They might be using data and metrics, but it will be really patchy. And then the next kind of group of businesses I see sort of further upstream are those that are seeing and treating climate risk as a business risk. And they're starting to look at it because maybe they're being nudged in that direction because of some regulatory perimeters that are asking them to start thinking about what does a risk mean from a governance perspective, maybe your strategy, and also, encouraging businesses to start looking at data and metrics. But integration is really patchy. There are some businesses that are using that data to make different decisions, and others that have made structural changes, but really treating it still like compliance. And then the last group of businesses I talk about are the ones that have really, really integrated it, climate risk, just like any other enterprise risk management item, where they're seeing the full picture, appreciating where it might pop up in insurance issues, procurement, due diligence, legal, all over the place. And they're the ones that are really using proper data, proper metrics to evidence what they're doing. So ideally, we'd be seeing more businesses moving in that direction.
Okay, well, let's just talk a little bit about data. So companies will say that data is a big challenge to tackling a lot of these challenges. There are known unknowns, but we need precision to act. What's changed the most in climate data in the last few years, and how is that reshaping decision making? And that's for Caroline to start.
Yeah, sure. So we're seeing that core data providers are starting to provide specific climate change data. So historically, the data that people use to make insurance quotes and to build that picture, it's all historic. It's an historic view based on today. But this climate change data is now looking forward. It's that projection. So it's looking at the different RCP scenarios. So the 4 different RCP. So you've got 2.6, 4.5, 6.0, 8.5. And it's those different points in time and how they can see the perils risk at those locations changing. So that could be the flood data, that could be subsidence data, but it is that forward-looking view on what is the impact on a location rather than looking at today and backwards. So that's the key change that we're starting to see.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
I'd just add to that. I think one of the really interesting developments of recent years is the strengthening of attribution science and the ability to link extreme weather events to climate change and to emitters, big polluters, is really, really important. And that science is getting better all the time. The ability to make the connections is strengthening all the time. And I think, coming back to the question of litigation or liability risk, that's going to lead to an increasing number of polluter pays litigation cases against big polluters, often class actions, damages claims that will really start to change the business model for some of these polluters. And for example, the big case underway at the moment is the victims of Typhoon Odette in the Philippines, with an attribution science case against Shell, saying that Shell's emissions are responsible for a certain proportion of climate warming, which made the typhoons more likely and more extreme. So I think that's, in terms of the sort of science data and ability to link the data to responsibility, I think that's really important.
I think one other thing I just wanted to add in is also the fact that we're seeing climate risk data popping up in more areas, just because there's more legal levers and more legal pressures now. So it's just an additional thought.
So maybe just to pull on the thread that Laura was on, I'd be curious to hear just a bit about where some of the risk lies that's not priced in, and what are the things that that companies should be most worried about, areas of emergent liability that just haven't really understood.
Yeah, I'd highlight 4, some more developed than others. The first is greenwashing liability and greenwashing claims, and those, ClientEarth has brought a whole suite of greenwashing litigation against BlackRock, litigation and complaints against BlackRock, Coca-Cola, KLM, Total Energies, and that, along with a changing regulatory framework, means the space for spurious green claims is really, really narrowed, and we're even seeing private sector greenwashing litigation. So I think because it's a matter of an unlevel playing field, if one company is saying it's doing the right thing but doing the opposite, that skews the playing field. So that's a big one, greenwashing. Directors' personal liability is a huge thing, right? At some point, the corporate veil will get pierced and directors will be held personally liable for not doing enough to manage climate risk. Now, ClientEarth brought a case a couple of years ago against the board of directors of Shell, saying that they weren't doing enough to manage climate risk. Now, that case didn't succeed, but the court explicitly acknowledged that climate risk is a material financial risk. So, our view is it's only a matter of time before directors are held liable for not managing climate risk. Then 2 others just quickly, the rise of supply chain due diligence laws, such as CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the EU deforestation regulation. They create meaningful risks for companies that are not doing the work and walking the talk in terms of what does their supply chain look like? What are the exposures there? They can no longer outsource or subcontract their environmental externalities to companies in the supply chain. And then the one that's sort of more distant on the horizon is linked to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion on climate change, which says very clearly that states have an obligation to regulate the climate impacts of non-state actors, so of businesses. And so, that is obviously evolving, but that will strengthen litigation against corporates, and it will also strengthen the impetus for more regulation of the private sector by states.
Just to pull on this, and I'd love, Simone, your thoughts on this too, but so just speaking of the EU, the ICJ, how should we understand where governments are on this? The EU, obviously, with the omnibus sort of softening, simplifying policy on this. You could look at other places like the US where there's a clear pullback in policy. How should businesses understand where government is leading them on climate risk? Maybe Simone and then Laura, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So again, I'd say it's a really mixed picture. There are definitely areas where we're seeing the market leading government. For example, like a lot of the disclosure requirements that we've seen in the reporting and disclosure field came about because investors were requiring better climate risk information from the businesses that they were dealing with. So that was an area where we saw the market leading, and we've seen the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD framework, come about from that, and that's now being formalised and sort of rolled out. But there are also instances where we see the governments leading, and going back to Laura's mentioning of the EU, there are some really interesting approaches that the EU's been taking with regards to sustainability requirements. For example, talking about the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, they don't just ask companies to look at themselves and say, what does climate risk mean to you? They're asking businesses to look outward and say, actually, what's your impact on the climate, on people, on the broader environment? And that's quite a different approach. That's what they call the double materiality lens. So I think it's quite a mixed picture.
Yeah. I agree fully. It's a very mixed picture. I think the EU has got everything it takes to be an extraordinary global leader on climate issues, but we do have these pressures of deregulation that are coming, but a huge amount that has been done in the EU that now needs to be properly protected, implemented, and enforced. I'd also call out, looking at Asia, we're seeing amazing progress from governments there. Justin, you wrote recently about Singapore, and Singapore has absolutely got the strategic imperative of this work and getting the right regulatory framework in place. We work a lot in China, and really, a very, very long-term view there about what is required. And in the Philippines, similarly, where we're supporting on the regulatory reform needed for the energy transition. So there's a lot there. And then businesses, you get some businesses that are really leading the way, but it's also important to note that you get businesses that are doing incredibly regressive lobbying, trying to stymie government's approach to doing the right thing, using their influence and their money to do that. And perhaps the worst example recently is the business influence in New Zealand, which has led the New Zealand government to make some amendments to stop climate litigation happening in terms of climate risk and climate damages. So it is, as you say, Simone, a very, very mixed picture with some bright spots and some dark ones.
So I think it's important. I was in Singapore last week, as you alluded to, just to remember the breadth of the different discussions happening. So many people can get focused on the the US, or even the EU, and there's a much broader world. I guess I'd like to maybe transition a little bit just to think about how businesses actually interpret and incorporate some of this into their actual work. And so, Caroline, you mentioned the RCP, the pathways and the sort of growing sort of ability to grapple with that. But how do businesses actually do that? Like, how do they build the capacity? How do they integrate that into their actual work? And then maybe, Simone, I'd be curious to hear a little bit about how legal sort of departments interact with some of the data and the science here. How do they actually build that into the work that they're doing?
Sure. So the product that I look after is geospatial intelligence, and we have some of our own product and other is third-party data. So we distribute JBA data, twin data, and BGS data as examples alongside some of our own models. So LexisNexis Windstorm, so that gives that view on the changing climates, those extreme weather events that you were talking about earlier, Laura. And what an insurer would do is they have a couple of options. They can integrate directly via API, and they will get that data at point of quote, so when they're making their decision making, and they then embed that into their pricing systems to understand, you know, the severity of the risk of that location. There's also an alternative that they can use, and it's a user interface that we have, so LexisNexis Map View. And what that means is that they can see on a map the impact of the data, to the climate data, on either an individual risk, or they can share their portfolio data, and they can see those different views of how climate change is starting to have an impact on the business that they're writing. So they have options on how they can integrate, but that data is readily available for them to use within their quoting or claims. So the other end, if claims are made, they can use that data to see if it was related to a climate change event.
Great.
I think that's interesting to hear about how it's happening kind of on the ground. I think kind of for legal teams, one of the most important things they can be doing is making sure this isn't treated in a silo. So it needs to be treated holistically, and they need to help the business join up the dots and understand where these risks can be popping up. And with that, making sure that there's consistent messaging across the business, because if the business is saying one thing on its website, another thing in its product marketing, and another thing in its investor deck, and none of that aligns with the data, that's where they're going to find themselves, you know, facing legal, reputational risks. So it's sort of that joined up piece, I think.
Agree.
So I think one thing is talking about consistent messaging from business to the public, and I'm in the business of telling stories, is it's important for people to really grapple with what's happening. And I guess my question is, what are some good stories, perhaps, about how businesses are understanding climate risk and resilience that the public doesn't understand, doesn't know, that perhaps should be told so that people can have a better sense and can take action?
Shall I have a go at that?
Go for it.
I mean, I think we just need so many more stories about businesses that did the work early. They're now ahead. They're now reaping the benefits of thinking about climate risk, incorporating all that, they need to do in terms of the transition into the heart of their business strategy. Companies that have got credible transition plans, robust supply chain due diligence, clean reporting, they will now be much better positioned on managing this risk. They'll have much greater investor confidence. They'll fall over much less with regulatory compliance issues and litigation, of course. And I think we are seeing a huge amount from B Corp, for example, really leading the way with more than 10,000 companies registered as B Corp. And there's some great stats about how they can grow their revenue and worker base much greater than the comparator sectors. They were more likely to survive the pandemic, for example. So we really need to hear these success stories, because so often it's just positioned as a cost or a boring compliance issue. It has to be positioned as the opportunity to become the businesses of the future and really thrive and build your customer base or your investor base or whatever it is with that confidence in how you are thinking long term and engaging with these issues.
Very, very well said. I feel like one of the challenges of the last few years is that after the ESG enthusiasm, which was about growth, it's become such a compliance issue, and the enthusiasm has tampered. I guess I'd be curious, Caroline or Simone, if you have other thoughts about stories that need to be told. Particularly maybe around about companies that are, for Caroline in your case, for companies that are doing a good job of using data to, mitigate risk.
I was going to say, it lines up to what Laura was saying there. It's the early adopters. And I think it's that with any data, isn't it? So the more data that you have, the more you understand the data and the impact that it has, that's where you start to see that real benefit. and it moves it on from being, I guess, to your point, Simone, you don't want that disjoint, but when the data is part of your day-to-day, you can then tie that in with the bigger picture and the other obligations.
Yeah, and just the point that it can be a competitive advantage if you get all of this right. It isn't, as Laura said, it's not all just about risk. It's about benefit as well, and understanding how you can make your business more resilient ultimately.
Great, Simone. Okay, great. So I guess maybe I'd like to just refer back, Laura. I think you mentioned tipping points at the very beginning, and some of these really big risks that might be on the horizon, or in some cases are on the horizon, and the scale of action that we're seeing today. And just to ask this really big picture question, which is, is the current pace of action that we see just fundamentally misaligned with the scale of the risk that's on the horizon?
Yes, I mean, absolutely, right? It's being done as a kind of on the sides. It needs to be. There was a brilliant letter last year written by insiders in the UK food industry saying that we are treating this issue as a tick box exercise, as a compliance issue. We need to be treating it collectively as a high likelihood, high impact, existential risk. And we are absolutely not doing that, because as you said, there's the risk of climate tipping points. You get kind of cascading risks. I'm in a very overheated London right now, but if you get extreme heat and you get drought, then you get the cascading impacts on food systems, on health systems, and those are the sorts of things that are not priced in. They're not, and so suddenly you get massive devaluations as it really ripples through the entire economy. So it is absolutely urgent, and we're not treating it with the urgency that we should.
Absolutely
Caroline
agree
or
with that.
Simone, do you have thoughts on that question, Caroline? Again, from the data perspective, looking at RCPs, etc.
Yeah, I think there's an increasing demand, isn't there, on data, but data requires data centers. That takes energy to keep them running. So it's just that overarching mindfulness of the balance there, and making sure that, carbon footprint and everything is taken into consideration as well. So whilst the data is important, it's making sure that the other factors are, taken into consideration. Sorry, Simone, I think I overspoke you at the start.
Oh, no, not at all. I was just going to add, and I completely agree with what you both said, that sadly the case is it's often the case that the law lags behind what's happening in the science and real world impacts. That's very, very often the case because of how long and often how complicated laws are to create, especially in a democracy where you can have back and forth, in Parliament and all over the place. So it's definitely not moving at the speed it should be. And often you see companies deprioritizing, even where they've set out they're going to do something. As the year goes on, they'll have different priorities pop up and it's kind of deprioritized, which then exposes them to, potential legal risks there as well if they've said they're doing something and they end up not really doing it. So, yeah.
So I guess maybe just to pull on I think something you said earlier, Simone, but I think somewhat connects to this last point about competitive advantage, which is just to ask, how do we reframe this so that companies understand it as competitive, as an opportunity to gain competitive advantage? What is the tool, the lever you think to do that? Perhaps even, you don't have to name specific companies, but sort of examples that would help give a sense of how to do that.
Well, I'll probably leave the naming of companies to Laura, because I think she'll probably know more about that than I do. But I think encouraging businesses to treat climate risk as they would any other financially material risk is really important, because then they'll understand exactly where the risks lie, what the opportunities are, and they'll fully map it across their business, and the picture will become much clearer then. As I've said throughout, it's about joining up the dots and creating that holistic piece. So if they treat it like they would any other financially material risk, it should help massively.
I guess Simone, Laura, sort of invited you to name specific companies, but I mean, just
yes. So I think I would also add to this. It's not just the absence of risk, liability risk, for example, in my case. It's also about what does it do to your brand, your reputation, your standing with investors, with consumers, with supporters, because it's a competitive world, right? And these things really, really matter. And just to name two, so Ørsted, the Danish energy company, has made enormous strides and is really reaping the benefits. Patagonia is a very, very oft-cited example of a incredibly sustainable clothing brand that again is doing incredibly well. So there's something about how you sort of seize the moment and you get that inspiration, and then people come with you, and it really, really does show how you do that work properly. You're absolutely confident that you've done the work properly, and then the benefits come to you in terms of support, in terms of investment, in terms of ability to expand in a sustainable way.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great discussion. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I mean, highlighting some of the real risks that are on the horizon, regulatory, the physical risks, the possibility of tipping points, which would have a dramatic impact for businesses. But we've also talked about the opportunity. And so it's important not to lose out that this is an opportunity for businesses. It's an opportunity to gain competitive advantage. So thank you to this panel, Simone, Laura, and Caroline. Learned a lot and appreciate it.
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, thanks
so much.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. That was fascinating to sit behind the scenes listening to that.